Hey, Blue Table fans, Spencer here, and today I thought I'd do a little video on a subject that we get asked a lot, and I see get asked on forums elsewhere, and that is what game is right for me? Well, that's a really tricky subject and a really tricky question to answer because there's a huge variety of games out there. And I know a lot of people are probably going, oh, well, there aren't that many. Well, trust me, there are. I spent 3 years as a gaming journalist. I had to review games and review rulebooks. I have a bookshelf just covered in gaming rulebooks for games I'm probably never going to play, but I got paid money to review. Games I didn't know existed, basically, until I actually went out searching for them. So it can be a little tricky finding the game that's right for you, because there's a lot of criteria and a lot of it is personal preference, but I thought I'd do a quick video and go over some of the basics of what to look for and what games might suit your need. Now obviously you have the big three. You have Warhammer, Warm Hordes, and Infinity. And in their own rights, all good games. All games that might really appeal to you. So let's start with Warhammer 40k, as it is the most popular game on the market, and that is its biggest selling point, is no matter where you live, if you have a game store, you're almost guaranteed to find somebody who plays that game. So if you're looking for a large army scale 28mm sci-fi game with a big player base and a huge selection of miniatures, and for the most part really nice miniatures. I mean, yeah, there's a few misses here and there, and some stuff's kind of old and desperately needs to be resculpted but isn't. See Eldar jet bikes. You're going to find people to play. You're going to have a big player base pretty much no matter where you go. Now, the downside to 40k, the ones that I see the most, are rules and price. The rules follow a very strict system with their phase system where you move, shoot, assault. Move, shoot, assault, move, shoot, assault. It's always the same order every turn. So you can't shoot at something and then if it doesn't die, go, oh, well, I'm going to book it behind this building to get out of charge range or get out of its line of fire and make it come to me. It's not as tactically flexible as certain other games on the market. That isn't a huge problem for everybody. It is a problem for a lot of people, though, especially myself. I don't like that. But it sticks to that system, a system that it's had for 2.5 decades. You know, it's been around for a while. So it's kind of stuck in that. The other big issue is price. Obviously, it's an expensive game. I mean, if you want to play competitively, and you know, a lot of people do, you're going to be shelling out a lot of money, especially if you play something like Tau, because you're going to need 3 Riptides, and each of those is $85. Now let's say you're looking for a 28mm science fiction game that uses armies and has squads of guys. Right now, your choices are kind of limited. There isn't a whole lot on the market to fill that. You can, however, if you don't want as big of an army as 40k, scale it down a bit and play Warzone Resurrection, which is science fiction, very similar in some aspects to 40k, but very different in others. And it's more in that gray area between skirmish and mass army game, where you have squads, but you're usually only going to have a few on the table, and it's not, you know, you have giant mechs and masses of tanks and stuff like that. Now, the disadvantage Warzone is going to have is that it hasn't hit full retail yet, at least here in the States. So it's going to be harder to get a hold of. And it's not quite as well known as something like 40k, but it does have a dedicated player base, and if you really go and you try and find people who play, you can. You can go onto the Protoss forums, and there's a player locator thread on there, so you can find people that play in your area. So let's move on, saying you want big armies. You want a big army that's going to take up a big chunk of your table, but let's say you want a fantasy game, where you have blocks of infantry, and they wheel, and they move, and they charge, and they fight, and all that cool stuff. Well, the first option is obviously Warhammer Fantasy. However, let's say you don't want to pay $80-something for a rule book that's like 500 pages, and you don't want your infantry to be so much as wound counters as you do actual models that are going to make an impact on the table. Now, Warhammer Fantasy has its advantages. I again, it's got a player base, it's got an established player base, and it really sticks close to the sort of fantasy tropes if you're into that. It's also got a huge array of armies, so you have a lot to pick from. I mean, there's 3 different elf factions in the game. There's, you know, like 3 different chaos factions, technically speaking. So you've got a lot of variety in your armies, and each one plays fairly differently. So there's a lot of diversity in the game. But like I said, let's say you want your infantry to do more than just fancy painted wound counters. You have other options. If you want to slim down the rules and not have something quite as complicated as Warhammer Fantasy, you can look into something like Kings of War from Mantic Games. Now, Kings of War is a good game in my opinion. It is a little simple at times, but it has its merits. For starters, it's affordable. The miniatures are very well priced, which means you can get a decent sized army without having to mortgage a house. And Kings of War has a very interesting system for how it plays, in that your infantry in the blocks, you don't remove models as the unit takes damage. You just use wound counters. So that way those guys that you spent all that time painting in that big 20 or even 40-man block of infantry aren't just fancy wound counters. They're there the whole time that unit is alive. And personally, I like that, because frankly, one thing that's really kind of disheartening is when you spend all this time painting a block of 40 spearmen, you go, okay, well, everybody beyond the 2nd rank is just a wound counter who's essentially going to be gone. I spent all this time painting them for 1 turn of effect, really. It also means you don't have empty movement trays everywhere when guys die, which is nice. Now, there is another game that falls into this that I can think of, and that is the War Gods series by Crocodile Games. War Gods takes a bit of a different approach to fantasy in that it's based on mythology. The current version of the game is War Gods of Aegyptus, which is Egyptian. So you have, you know, hawk-headed Heru fighting against jackal-headed Anubis and all that cool stuff. So if you're really into ancient mythology, War Gods is a great series, and it's a good game. It does suffer from not having a huge player base. You won't find players everywhere you go, and a lot of stores don't seem to carry it. But it is a good game. If you're looking for that kind of thing, and you got a group of people who are also looking for that kind of thing, pitch it to them. It's a cool game. It's got very innovative mechanics. It's got very cool models. The Olympus supplement is coming out soon, which will let you play with Greek mythology, so you have demigods and titans and centaurs and satyrs and minotaurs and all this cool stuff. So if you're into mythology and you want a game like that, War Gods is the way to go. War Gods also has a much smaller model count compared to Warhammer Fantasy, as does Kings of War. Kings of War, you can have blocks of 40 guys, but it's not like Warhammer Fantasy is currently, where it almost seems required that you have blocks of 40 guys. You have these huge units of guys and like a level 4 wizard. Kings of War, you can play with just blocks of 20 guys and no wizards at all, and it really doesn't make it so you feel like you're going to auto-lose the game. Same thing with War Gods. War Gods, most times you're not going to see blocks bigger than 20. You might see a 30-man block if somebody's really devoted to that unit, killing everything it comes across. Now let's say you're looking for a skirmish game. You don't want a ton of models. You don't have a lot of time to paint 400 dudes to put on a table just to have them die instantly. So you want a skirmish game. You want something where you're only going to have to paint like 10 to 20 guys total. You have a lot of options. I mean, just a bewildering number of options at this point. You have anything, really. You have so much choice. And it really just depends on the genre that you want to play and the style of game you want to play. So if you like Old West, you're looking at Malifaux and Wild West Exodus, which are both good games but very different in their own rights. Malifaux, of course, being a diceless system. Everything is card-based. But Malifaux is a great game. It's got really good mechanics, especially 2nd edition. I played 1st edition and did not like it. It felt clunky, unfocused, and just wasn't fun. Stat cards had like 4,000 different things on them. Second edition has streamlined and cleaned it up and made it an infinitely better game. It also has beautiful miniatures. Malifaux has some of the best looking plastic miniatures on the market. It's also affordable. It can be a little pricey depending on what you buy, especially if you're buying the older metal model, but the newer plastics are quite affordable, and Weird has done a very good job at making the game easy to get into by just buying a starter box. Wild West Exodus, on the other hand, is a dice-based system, and it plays a lot differently. I've not actually sat down and played a game at this point, but I have read the quick start rules, and it's a good system. It's got a lot of very cool ideas in it, and it's got a ton of potential, and the models, again, great, beautiful plastic miniatures. Not quite as affordable as Malifaux, and you probably need a few more models than you do in Malifaux. Most Malifaux games are going to have like 6 models in your army. Wild West Exodus definitely feels like it's more large-scale skirmish, sort of like War Machine or Warzone Resurrection. But let's say Old West isn't your thing, you want fantasy. Well, you've got options for that. And there's a bunch of options. You have World of Twilight, which is a very interesting, very unique game that recently had a Kickstarter to fund a compilation book and new miniatures. And it's very cool. It's got some kind of weird rules. I mean, they're not weird in a bad way, but weird in a, I've never really seen that before kind of way. And it's a good thing. Honestly, I did a sort of first impressions review of that years ago, and it had a lot of potential, and it definitely looks like it's been cleaned up. I pledged to Kickstarter. I'm getting all the big compilation book and stuff. So, and it's a very cool game in that it's a fantasy sort of skirmish game, but there's no elves, humans, dwarves, or anything. It's a completely unique setting, and I really suggest you guys check it out. Especially if you're tired of the standard humans, elves, and dwarves. I'd be remiss at this point not to mention War Machine and Hordes. They are much more on the larger end of skirmish, where you're going to have squads of guys, but you're only going to have like 2 in an army. And a big thing, this kind of comes down to its own sub-question of, well, what do I play? Do I play War Machines or do I play Hordes? And the simple answer is, do you like big robots? Go with War Machine. Do you like big monsters? Go with Hordes. They use the same basic rule system. The only thing that's different between the two is how the armies are designed, like the aforementioned robots versus big monsters, and how the magic systems work. But otherwise, they're the same game. They're designed to be played against each other, and it opens up a lot of diversity. And they are solid games. I mean, the second edition of those games really cleaned up those systems and really just improved them, and honestly made them some of the best systems on the market. Let's say you're looking for something more science fiction for your skirmish game. Well, there's the aforementioned Warzone Resurrection, which I already covered in quite a bit of detail, and I've been blabbering on about in videos for a while. The big one, though, is Infinity. If you want a small, sort of special ops style sci-fi game, Infinity is the best way to go, in my opinion. It's got beautiful models. The rules are good, if a little bit clunky at times. The third edition is coming out soon. The new Operation Ice Storm box is coming out. And you don't need a lot of stuff for it. You can buy a starter box and 2 blisters and be set for a little while. And there's such a huge variety of different weapons that different units can take, that you're never really going to end up having to play the same thing twice, which is a huge thing to me, because playing the same list over and over and over and over and over and over and over again gets boring. And I don't like doing that, and I don't like playing against people who do that. So having that diversity, having those options is pretty huge to me. Now say you want something a little more historical. Well, you want a historical skirmish game? Play Saga. It's really, in my opinion and in the opinion of many of my friends that I've talked to, the best option on the market for that. There are other options. The various games made by Two Fat Lardies are very skirmish sort of based, and they're good games. They can use a little polishing sometimes, but they're still solid games. But speaking of historical, say you want something big. Well, you got a lot of options there too. Probably your best option, in my humble opinion, are the games offered by Warlord Games. That would be your Hail Caesar, Black Powder, Pike and Shot, and Bolt Action. And it really depends on the era you want to play. If you want Ancients, Hail Caesar is a great game. If you want Napoleonics, Black Powder is a great game. You can also play Sharp Practice by Two Fat Lardies if you want slightly smaller scale in terms of number of guys, not actual scale of the models. And there's a ton of others, guys. I mean, there's so many historical games. I can't even begin to remember all of them, so I'm just kind of covering the ones I know and that I'm familiar with and I know are kind of popular. But yeah, if you want, so you want Pike and Shot era, you want 30 Years' War, English Civil War, Pike and Shot, pretty self-explanatory game. And then you have Bolt Action for World War II. Now, all these games are primarily designed to be played at 28mm, but they can be scaled down if you want to play with 15, 6, 10, you scale it up if you want to play with 30 and 40mm models. So they have a lot of variety. The rules are all very similar, and they share, or at least for Hail Caesar, Black Powder, and Pike and Shot, they have a very similar idea behind the rule set. They share a basic principle. Bolt Action is kind of the oddball out because it's a very different setting. Because it's not blocks of infantry, it's individual guys and squads because it's World War II, and that's just kind of how it works. Now, all these games are great, and they have a huge variety of models available because there's just tons of stuff out there. You know, if you want Napoleonics, you have your choice from the miniatures Warlord makes to miniatures Victrix from the Perry brothers and all their extremely awesome sculpts that are coming out. So you have a huge option. You're not limited to just having to buy from one company. And you get a big variety, at least in like Napoleonics and Ancients, you have a big variety of armies to pick from. Because Napoleonics, you have all these European nations. You've got France, you've got Prussia, you've got Russia, you've got Austria, you've got the British. You can do, you know, these little armies from you know, these other countries. The Dutch. I mean, the Perry brothers have a full line of Dutch Napoleonic models, which is pretty cool. Now, say you want World War II, but Bolt Action doesn't do it for you. Flames of War is probably the most popular World War II game on the market, and it's a good game. It suffers the foible of having a phase system move, shoot, assault, but I feel at 15mm it actually kind of works. So what is each of those games really good for? Well, Bolt Action is good for infantry, sort of platoon level skirmishes, where you're going to have one, maybe two tanks if you're really sort of set your armies up right. Flames of War is good for mass armies. You're going to have the ability to do tank platoons. Yeah, I know Warlord's coming out with a tank supplement for Bolt Action. It's just going to be playing tanks. But even then, you're only going to have like 4, maybe 5 models. Flames of War, you have a tank platoon, you literally have 4 or 5 models per a unit. So you can fit a lot of tanks when, you know, they're that big. So you have a lot of options there, and Flames of War just covers everything, and they cover all of the different countries that were involved. I mean, I played mid-war Italians, and there's an army that doesn't get any love anywhere, you know, for World War II, because everybody always thinks of the big four. You've got US, Germans, Commonwealth, Russia. And you might even throw Japan in there, and they just recently came out in Flames of War with that. But Flames of War does give you a lot of variety that you can play all these little smaller nations. You can play Finland, Hungary, Romania, Italy. You know, there's rules for playing, for running Brazilians, Argentinians, all of this stuff. So there's a huge variety of choice for Flames of War, and it has a huge player base. So if you want 15mm, you want to be able to field huge armies, massive amounts of tanks, and you want World War II, Flames of War is the best way to go. Now, I'm moving completely in the opposite direction. Let's say you want robots. I mean, you want stompy mechs just blowing each other up. You're really limited. supremely limited in your options there, and that's an unfortunate thing. Right now, you have BattleTech and you have Heavy Gear. BattleTech has its flaws. It's a very complicated game with a lot of stat tracking and a lot of keeping track of everything, and there's a lot of paperwork and tables and charts everywhere. It can be a confusing mess, but it is a good game. It is much more of a tactical simulator than a war game. However, if you like BattleTech, you like MechWarrior, you love those designs, and you want to play an actual war game of it, there is a set of BattleTech rules called Alpha Strike, which are designed to be a miniatures war game. It doesn't use the hex map, and the rules are streamlined and simplified to make it easier to get into. And I actually really like that because I do love BattleTech, but man, it is hard getting people into it. And Alpha Strike, I think, is going to make it a lot easier to get people into it. And it's also going to mean that it's going to be easier to just toss together armies, because you don't have to sit there and figure out all these little things that go into building a force in classic BattleTech. Now, your other major option is Heavy Gear, which is a fantastic game. Heavy Gear is a 12mm game. It's mainly focused on the mechs, or gears as they call them. But there are tanks and infantry in it as well, and you have that in BattleTech too. BattleTech, for those wondering, is 6mm scale. Now, Heavy Gear is currently going through a rules update where they're doing the alpha and beta, and they're going to be releasing a new edition of the Heavy Gear Blitz rules early next year. At least that's, as of time of recording, is the plan. Now, Heavy Gear is a great game. It did have its issues where it was a little complicated at points, but I've read the alpha rules and I've been keeping up with the new rule set that they're working on, and they're streamlining it, and they're making it a lot easier to get into and a lot simpler to play. I still like the current iteration of Heavy Gear Blitz. It's still a fun game, but the new version is definitely making things more fast-paced. It's definitely going to be, from what I can tell so far, in my opinion, it's going to be a better game, and that's what the game needs. Now, both these games suffer from the age-old problem of not having people to play. It's very hard to find players, but if you have, again, a group of friends who are looking to get into something, and they all go, you know what, we like robots, give them a try. Heavy Gear has very beautiful models, but it is pricey. BattleTech has some very beautiful models. It also has some really fugly models that have been around for 20 years. So you kind of got to weigh your pros and your cons and figure out which one you want. Now, in this entire video, I've only been mentioning games that are currently in production. And I don't want to discount the games that aren't out yet, or games that are discontinued but are still fun, because there's a lot out there. In the discontinued but still fun, you have games like Blood Bowl, where if you want a more modern sci-fi version, you play Dreadball by Mantic. There's also Wartime, which is a great game. It needs some tweaking and house ruling to really make it shine, but it's still a fun game. There's a ton of different war bands, and everybody can kind of customize their own stuff, and it's great because it's a narrative-driven campaign system, and it's fun. While we're on the subject of discontinued games, Workshop games, you've also got War Master if you want Warhammer Fantasy at 15mm, so you can field a massive army of guys and not take up an entire table like you currently do in Warhammer 8th Edition. War Master is a great way to go. It does suffer from the fact that the models are out of print and hard to find, as with every out of print game around. You've also got Necromunda if you want a 40k based skirmish game, and then you have Battlefield Gothic if you want your space naval game. If you're looking for a space naval game that's currently in production, Firestorm modded by Spartan Games is a great choice. Now, there's a ton of other discontinued games. You have Confrontation by Rackham, you also have AK-43 by Rackham, both filling their own kind of little niches there. And both of them were good games. If you're looking for those sorts of things, they're definitely worth a look. There's also a ton of games on the horizon in the future coming out. Stuff that's up for pre-order. You've got stuff like All Quiet on the Martian Front, which is a great game. You've got Robotech RPG Tactics coming out if you want more big stompy robot action. The aforementioned War Gods of Olympus is coming out. There's just tons and tons and tons of stuff out there. And it really is a good time to be a miniatures wargamer. We have so many options for so many different types of games now that there's no reason that you should ever feel like, oh, well, there's just not a game out there for me, because there is. Sometimes you gotta dig a little deep to find it, but it exists. I assure you it exists. As my wallet and my Kickstarter account and my shelf of books will tell you, it exists. So guys, thanks so much for watching. I know I didn't cover every single thing in this video. I'm kind of remiss not to mention Drop Zone Commander. It's a great game, 10 mil sci-fi. If you want big tank battles in science fiction, it's a great way to go. But like I said, there's a lot that I didn't mention. There's just so many games, too many for me to cover in one video and keep it a decent length. I mean, I could do a video covering every single game I can think of, but then we'd be here for 6 hours. And frankly, nobody wants to look at my ugly mug for 6 straight hours. So anyway, if there's a game that you think I left out, that you think deserves recognition, leave it in the comments below. Heck, just tell me what your favorite game is in the comments below. I want to see what people are really into. If you guys have any questions about different games, feel free to leave a comment or shoot us an email or send us a message on Facebook, and we'll be glad to give you whatever information we can. We're glad to talk about it, because this is our love, this is our hobby, this is our life, is miniatures war game. Also, don't forget, if you're interested in getting an army for any of the games I mentioned, or even games I didn't mention painted up from Blue Table Painting, send an email to projects@bluetablepainting.com. Talk to Steve. He'll get you prices, he'll get you taken care of, and he'll get you hooked up, and we can get you an awesome looking army for your game of choice in no time flat. Once again, guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I will see you guys later.